During the historic winter storm in February that hit the US, freezing temperatures knocked out power for days, leaving millions of people in the bitter cold and darkness. Many were left homeless, and more than 100 people died during the storm, according to state officials. Some have called it a humanitarian crisis. But when the sunshine returned, many Houston residents that we talked to didn't complain much. Instead, they were busy fixing their water pipes and getting back to their normal lives. They shrugged, said it was just the weather, not realizing that no, it was a lot more than that.
But the Texas winter storm shouldn't have and didn't come as a surprise because weeks before the storm hit, scientists had already been warning about a possible weather event that disrupts typical winter climate patterns and leads to extreme winter weather in some parts of the US. There are people who think that the severity of the situation in Texas during winter storm was actually caused by the blackouts, so maybe a more stable power supply could be a very effective solution against the next winter storm. But as a matter of fact, the vulnerable power grid might have contributed to the blackouts that swept across the state in the first place.
Energy consumption is responsible for 73% worldwide greenhouse gas emissions, by far the biggest among economic sectors. Within the sector, generation of heat and electricity is responsible for most emissions, taking up to 30% of total global emissions. And in 2019, the US's renewable energy consumption reached 11%, almost just a fourth of petroleum consumption.
High greenhouse gas emissions accelerate climate change and lead to extreme weathers like the winter storm in Texas happen a lot more often.
I think we're at a transition time. Historically, no one's really cared or had any reason to care where their electricity comes from, but because electricity is so strongly tied, electricity generation is so strongly tied to CO2 emissions and climate change, and people now are starting to ask questions about where their electricity comes from.
Or maybe sometimes they don't get the answer they want to hear.
True.
Unsatisfied with the development of green energy, some people decided to take matters into their own hands.
There are cases that are called CCAs, meaning Community Choice Aggregators, meaning that local residents who are no longer happy with receiving dirty energy from their providers would team up and take charge of selecting electricity providers for the community according to their own green standards. Not only does this provide green electricity to these households, but it also contributes to the acceleration of social transformation for these large providers because, after all, it means that they're losing business. There are cases called community solar. It means that residents can either buy or lease a portion of the solar panels in the area and receive an electric bill credit for electricity generated by their share of the community solar system. For people who are unable to install solar panels on their roofs because they don't own their homes or have insufficient solar resources or any other reason, this is also a way to go. But there are problems with this as well.
So for a residential installation, only like 10% of the total installed cost is the solar panels themselves. The other 90% is the so-called balance of systems, which is paying an engineer to figure out where you put the panels around the chimney, in the vent pipe. It's not just like, oh, the engineers need to make better solar panels or cheaper solar panels. So it's kind of a time when there's the opportunity and the need for democratized innovation in order to further reduce costs and accelerate the installation.
According to a 2019 Pew Research Center survey, 77% of US adults are in favor of exploring alternative energy resources. The same report points out 67% of Americans think the government is doing too little to fight climate change.
I think the idea of a grassroots movement where individuals act is very limited in its potential for the following reason. You have to be well off to make sacrifices to limit your energy. If I live in a family with 2 cars, maybe we'll drive 1 car or a smaller car. But if you look at the expectation and demands of the vast majority of the world that are poor, they vastly outnumber the rich of the world who can make these sacrifices. And there is no way to balance the rising demand for energy of the poor of the world against these individual sacrifices.
Although how much can community choice change America's energy industry is still a question.
From the cost-effectiveness perspective, using clean electricity seems worth it since it takes on directly one of the biggest contributors of global emissions. But if for any reason you don't want to make changes to your energy provider yet, turning up the lights when leaving the room is also a good way to reduce the energy consumption, save money and the world. When it comes to climate, no action is too small.